I'm going to try and spend the next few minutes talking about 2110 and complementary technologies and look at some of the challenges. But before I do that, just wanted to show you, I'm actually based on that side of the UK, on the east coast, very near only about a kilometre from the sea there. So I actually did a Google thing. It's 244 kilometres. So if I'd have gone on my little rowing boat I got in the garden, I reckoned it would have taken about 40 hours. So I gave up on that. I know quite a few people did a run that was, I think, set up by Tata from London, not a run, a bike ride from Tata via Harwich to the Hook and then to here. So I wish I'd actually had the energy to join part of that. Anyway, it's good to be with you from the other side of that piece of water. And then when I was thinking about going on water and IP, I thought of IP68. So this is the water ingress rating for equipment. I just thought it was very appropriate. There's no other reason to put it up other than it was IP and we're on water. Anyway, just a quick resume on a few things that I think are really, really important for our customers as we are or content producers as we're actually on this journey. I've boiled it down to like 4 very, very straightforward things that seem to be the common themes through absolutely everything that we're doing. People want to up the production value. They want to lower the cost. They want increased flexibility, and they want high availability. Ticking all those boxes is what we're all about doing. And every time we have a conversation with a customer, it's all about those things. And obviously, the lower cost enables a higher production value on more events. So that's the key thing there. Now, you may have seen this slide. I've used this a few times in the last year or so. I think the first time I showed it was IBC last year. I call it the 3 Ps. And when we started to do IP transformation, we've been doing IP wide area networks for well over 20 years. But when we started doing facility transformation, I think the first one we did was 7 years ago. Then it was really pretty well at that point about replacing SDI cables. Oh, this is exciting. Replacing SDI cables with IP infrastructure, IP fibers, which gave us a spatial and temporal format agnostic connectivity, but didn't really leverage any workflow transformation. What we're now seeing with this fully distributed production technology that we're able to do, where we've got a flexible wide area and facility connectivity, we can actually have our processing, our people, and our places anywhere we want. And that really is transformational in terms of benefit to actually the cost saving and the flexibility. So ticking some of those boxes on that first diagram that we had. And I'm not going to dwell on this, but it's a very useful thing I keep referencing back to. I had some conversations with a DPP on this only a couple of months ago. This was some work that we did in lockdown, looking at the different models of distributed production. And if you can't see the text from where you are, basically fundamentally the dark blue is acquisition, the light blue is process, the light yellow is storage and processing, and the orange is control. And all of the different scenarios in distributed production we're working to in the industry involve those sometimes being completely co-located, but different elements can be in different places, and that's where we leverage the real cost saving and benefits and flexibility. A few quick slides on moving from the bespoke to the generic. And I think that's a really, really important transformation in the industry that we're seeing. So let's start with connectivity. We know we were using BNC connectors with SDI and HDSDI and unbelievably 12 gig SDI. I still don't quite understand how that works on a piece of coax. And AES67 or AES3 there. And then we're moving to a complete digital infrastructure. So we're using standard Ethernet connectivity. So there are no broadcast connectors in what we're doing now. It's standard Ethernet connectors. So we've moved from the bespoke to the generic. Then in terms of processing, we're very much moving from traditional single pieces of equipment that do a specific process in a broadcast environment to actually having very generic processing tools which actually can do a plethora, all of the different things that we want to do. Then we're also doing what Felix Poulon from CBC calls dematerialization, where we're actually, in a lot of cases, not even having the equipment in our facility anymore. We're actually having it in somebody else's facility in a data center, either a public or private data center. So that's again, a part of that move from the bespoke to the generic in what we're doing. Also, the bespoke to the generic, I think is still happening, is even still happening on connectivity. So one of the massive trends that we've seen in the last few years is almost all connectivity for broadcast until a few years ago was on private leased lines, deterministic. Originally, maybe it was like 2 megabit per second circuits or 155 megabit per second SDH or 1 gig or 10 gig Ethernets. But now we're actually seeing more and more people, mainly because the quality of public internet connectivity is getting better and better. It's still not deterministic. We still need to use some tricks to actually make it behave, some ARQ technology, some FEC, some dash 7 tools. But basically, we're able to move for lots of even fairly high profile contribution from costly private lease line down to something that probably costs less than a tenth by using high bandwidth interconnect that's provided over effectively public internet connectivity. So that's really important. In the RF space as well, the transformation, I've been doing a lot of work on 5G recently, and we're moving from what I call bespoke COFDM infrastructure to actually saying, and bespoke satellite infrastructure to saying we can actually use standard off-the-shelf, relatively low-cost tools to allow us to actually do that connectivity as well. So there's that massive trend from the bespoke to the generic as we move from there. So one of the things I think is very important to think about is whatever technology we're using, and we'll come on to 2110 and the other technologies in a minute, the things that are most important and the things that are here to stay is the human interface elements. So on the acquisition side, we've got the microphones, we've got the cameras, we've got the tactile panels that people want to touch to actually make the control. And at the far end, we've got the speakers, we've got the monitors that people are looking to consume. And of course, they may be on a mobile phone, on headphones or whatever. Everything else in the infrastructure, and some of you will have seen this slide that I've used before. I think this is a pivotal slide because this underpins the next few minutes of what I want to talk about is, so that acquisition is always going to be a linear process because we're capturing 25 or 30 frames a second, or if you're in America, 29 point something frames a second of video. We're displaying it back in real time, be that on a phone, on a television, for the end viewer. And those people involved in the gallery, in the sound booth, need to actually hear and see that video and audio in real time. But more and more, we're moving to an ecosystem as we become more software-based, where more and more of this can be non-linear compute. Now, there is some things here. First of all, in the traditional pieces of broadcast equipment that many of us have been involved in designing over the last tens of years, I guess 90 years since it started, very, very deterministic performance. What we're now looking at is compute. And compute, because it's doing lots of things, tends to be bursty, and there's generally a much less deterministic execution time for doing the processing. And the reason I wanted to raise that is because that plays into what we're going to talk about in a minute. So we have this time-aware process here. Giving a shout out to Richard from Matrox. He's been doing some talks about this. I recommend you check it out because I think he does some good explanations of some of the area that I was talking about here. So going back to my picture, there's this linear acquisition, linear consumption, and then what I've been calling for the last 3 years, non-linear connectivity in the middle, non-linear process connectivity. Needs to be time aware, time tracking, but it can be non-linear. And Richard has been calling in the Matrox world, calling this asynchronous. So they're calling it asynchronous production in the Matrox world. So I suggest you check that out because, as you can see, there's they're talking about real-time streams here, and then the asynchronicity in the middle. So do check that out because that actually demonstrates that. One of the key things as we move into this more and more asynchronous world, in terms of using native compute as it behaves best, is that not only have we got our traditional live production workflow stuff with the audio mix, the vision switcher, etc., but once we've done that ISO ingest in real time into our compute infrastructure, then a lot of these tools, which have been the preserve of offline functions, post-production, NLE functions, they are actually, if they run fast enough, can actually become part of our ecosystem of actually doing the live production. So suddenly some of those AI tools to do automatic highlights production, the augmented reality stuff, all of that. Once we're in a compute world, as long as we've got it architected well, suddenly all of these tools can actually come along and work very effectively. One observation in broadcast is people are used to things in the old days of actually being very fast, because it was the speed of light through processors, and even in galleries. This is a sports production gallery in the UK. In galleries and in studios, people were used to actually working with 1, 2, 3 frames maximum propagation delay through a process. I put this slide up because once people suddenly saw the creative potential of virtual reality and augmented reality tools, suddenly they're prepared to tolerate half a second of processing latency because it gives them a creative value they can't have. So my observation is that whilst there are several static things that people say we can only live with this much latency, we can only do this in a certain way, once a creative tool gives you added creative production value, the creatives will actually find a way to live with the latency that's incurred. And I think that lesson, and I'm going to talk about latency towards the end, that lesson is very, very important. So adjacent technologies to 2110. Many of you have heard me speak about 2110 a lot, but what I wanted to talk about is some elephants in the room, if you like, alongside the 2110 infrastructure, which we've been lovingly honing for the last 6 years as part of our journey. So NDI is a single vendor, but now very, very highly supported interconnect technology that's being used by many, many places. And Dante is something that was there obviously before 2110 was there, and it's one of several what I call proprietary but open audio standards, which has been in significant use. And to be shout out to the digital audio guys, AS67, that was the inspiration for us as we did digital video with 2110. These tools have got lots of capabilities, but they've also got some uniqueness and some challenges as we interconnect and sit them alongside standard 2110 infrastructure. So typically, what I think we're doing most of the time at the moment is what I call intelligent gatewaying. So we have typically in larger broadcasters a complete ecosystem of 2110 infrastructure. That is now a pretty mature thing, including the NMOS control that sits alongside the SMPTE. And what we're tending to create is gateways that sit in and out of the Dante audio islands and the NDI islands. And actually, for lots of situations, that actually works very well, having a clump of NDI production. One thing that I think we're going to do better as an industry, and I know people who are working on this, including ourselves, is more intelligent gatewaying. So you don't actually have to have an island that's disconnected, but we can coexist. And that not only involves a data plane, because if you look at Dante, the audio samples, the actual audio flow itself can be fully compatible with AS67 and 2110, but it's the control plane stuff that's not. So in both of these terms, it's the discovery, it's the control elements, the plug and play elements that make both of these very exciting, that needs to actually be honed and adapted, and we're working on those techniques to do that. I'm going to jump through this very quickly, but I just wanted to give a little bit of history of thinking as to where we're at in terms of the legacy we've had from the last 90 years. So the raster scan was developed right at the beginning of television. It used to be very initially the other way up. It was going vertically rather than horizontally on the very first test they did. But we've lived with this, and including 2110 actually pays homage to this, because we still have the way we handle 2110. We still actually allow for the raster and the way we do things, which is maybe slightly crazy, including the timing schemes that we have, to allow those gap timings. That's all to do with the legacy of the legacy of raster scan, even though we're trying to actually just carry active picture information. And then everything about the way we've transported it has been then a linear flow of data due to the raster scan and the way that works. So in SMPTE 2110, and you can see this is like most of the elements of the standard and the NMOS control at the bottom. There's a couple I want to focus on, which is the -10 and the timing in -21. So the Dash 10 has been evolved recently. We've done some revisions on that standard. And the timing 21, I just wanted to rewind and let you think a little bit about why we did such precise timing requirements in Dash 21. It's all to do with packet integrity and the risk of losing packets in an infrastructure. So what we have, everything we do in 2110 is UDP, RTP, and that is a fragile transport because it's not got handshaking. It's a fire and forget technology, whereas all of these other standard IP technologies of different owned by different people, but TCP and these others actually have effectively a built-in handshaking mechanism. So you know that you're going to get that through. Because of the fragility of this, we want to make sure that we don't lose packets. So in a traditional switch, this is a very, very simple switch diagram. We have buffers at the front end. And if the buffer is not big enough to cope with the burst of data that you get coming through, if you have lots of synchronous data that's flying through, if it was not a linear flow, but if it was coming all at the head of the frame, then you can actually get buffer overflow, and then we start to drop packets. So the whole reason for Dash 21 and 2110 was to actually make sure that with typical buffer sizes here on switch fabrics, we didn't actually start to lose UDP data because there is no mechanism inherent in 2110 to recover it once it's become lost. So what we do across in various places is we do actually use tricks with UDP. We have 2022-7, which is almost ubiquitously applied everywhere. That's an RTP layer merge technology. Then in some scenarios, especially in wide area networks, we deploy FEC and ARQ technologies, especially on public internet connectivity. ARQ is vitally important, although there is an impact certainly in doing these two, and especially ARQ on the latency, and we'll come back to latency in a minute. But it's one observation I've got is we do need to be careful in an infrastructure when we're mixing RTP UDP flows with TCP flows, and especially when we're actually emanating that from software infrastructure, because what we've been doing with software devices that comply to 2110 is very, very carefully traffic shape the output, the egress flows of devices to make sure they're compliant to the model so we don't get that buffer overflow. But with TCP, and I'll come on to that in a minute, then that actually can be a challenge because that tends to be bursted at line rate interface from compute because there is no inherent traffic shaking mechanism in use. I just want to talk very briefly about data integrity in the public cloud. So we've been used to, again, in the broadcast industry, using telco infrastructure, which normally in most territories of the world is quasi-error free. It actually works very reliably, and you have very few actual errors apart from in problematic situations. If you actually look at the way public cloud works in terms of switching, and people are starting to use certain public cloud providers to do long-haul connectivity as well, and in doing that, they actually assume more of a background packet loss as business as usual because the switches are not as deterministic, and there is most of what public cloud providers are doing is TCP based. So the occasional packet loss is not an issue because it just sorts itself out in the background. But now we're throwing lots of UDP data into that TCP environment, then we have some challenges, and that's why we have to do protection mechanisms to allow that. In addition, just an observation for those of you that are not familiar, as we're starting to use compressions, especially to get in and out of cloud infrastructure, then inherently a compression is going to create a variable bitrate stream. Most cases, the way we actually handle that in a broadcast environment is to actually basically control the loop, the quantized loop, to make sure we actually end up with a constant bitrate stream that goes to line. Just an observation on NDI here. So a couple of things. First of all, NDI typically, by default, uses TCP. So if you've got lots of high-rate NDI streams, they're going to be coming out of your interface, and the compute is likely to burst it out at line rate. So if you've got a 10 gig interface on your compute, then you're likely to get the NDI packets when they're ready being pushed out burstily at high rate. The other observation about NDI, when you're just integrating it alongside other infrastructure, such as constant bitrate flows, like from audio and 2110 video, is that it's highly variable bitrate, because it actually makes natural use of the entropy. There's no feedback loop to actually do. It's an open loop compression tool. So what you get is very high highs and lows in terms of the data flows coming in. We need to be aware of that, because you're potentially mixing UDP with TCP, you're mixing CBR with VBR, and there are some challenges in the traffic engineering as you do that. Very nearly here. So typically what we do with compute virtualized infrastructure functions in broadcast at the moment is we have these thick red lines, because we typically receive them as compliant 2110. We push them out as compliant 2110, and that actually takes some overhead to actually do that engineering of the linearity back into switch fabric. What we need to get to in the end game with this asynchronous connectivity we've been talking about, that non-linear thing, is coming in linear, the red line, then actually having compute-friendly data handover techniques that actually hand between the virtualized processing functions, and then we can relinearize at the far end, and obviously associate the timing as we want it to be for there. There's some work happening on some of this in the VSF. We've got some work trying to standardize and evolve an API that sits above compute, that actually allows us to do this bulk handover, that actually allows us to actually have that compute-friendly behavior. Do check that out. Here's some links here. And there's also some thinking about, is the ground to cloud and cloud to ground element always going to be linear, or are we actually going to become non-linear and asynchronous further down the line? Could we eventually have asynchronicity from the camera itself? So we're actually having asynchronous data flows rather than the nice linear flows we've been loving for the last 90 years. One piece of work I'm doing at the moment this autumn, and this is just an appeal for any input you've got, is studying tolerable latency. So all of this distributed production we've been talking about, and actually using compute, using different locations, what we are always looking at is what latency is tolerable for the creatives involved in making the content. I think we've got some pretty good ideas on some of these. The audio back within the environment has to be very tight. We're looking at 5 milliseconds as a limit. There are some other control loops where maybe we've got a few hundred milliseconds that we can allow. What's the return on tally? If anyone has got any input they'd like to give me on specific experience or specific objective values on some of these, I'm trying to build up a scenario, and obviously it's application dependent scenarios here to create some guides on latency. So do feed into there. So whistle-stop tour of the 3 Ps, distributed production, how we actually sit these different production technologies alongside each other. I've only tickled the surface. I'd love to talk to you more if you'd like to, probably once we get off the boat. And so we can have a chat. I'm around, and tomorrow, Monday, is a pretty good day to talk. I'll be on the Sony stand. So do come and see us in Hall 13 if you haven't been there already. Hopefully you're not seasick. Hopefully I've not whistled through that quite too quickly, but hopefully I've triggered some thinking. I'd love to discuss it with you further if you like. So thank you very much, and it just